Jacksonville. The child was born and couldn't sit still. 86 years later with no regret. You know that man can't sit still yet. The Great Depression couldn't get him down. He worked for his dad's store in town, collecting money in small amounts. The poor whites and blacks in their furniture accounts. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. Stetson Kennedy wants us all to be free. As he'd collect, he'd talk to folks. He'd hear legends, tales, songs, and jokes. Now this fine treasure he'd record and write. He was colorblind, didn't see black and white. Writer's project for the WPA. Zora Neale Hurston, he earned his pay. Crackers and blacks, they talk for hours. It was a barefoot history of this land of flowers.
The week that was on the 4th of August 2018 from WBRN Radio and over the Boston Red Network. We move along looking at some of the events that shaped the past week and events that will shape the week coming forward here. Some of these events have been going on for a number of days, a number of weeks, a number of months. Incidentally, happy birthday to President Obama. Today is his birthday. I'm not certain how old President Obama is. I believe he's 55, but he could be 56. Anyway, nonetheless, happy birthday to President Obama. A little good news today. We have Uncle Carl Robe, as we usually do on Saturday morning, as Jesse Jackson would say, at the Dr. King workshop there in the city of Chicago. We also have a dispatch from Turning South on the Poor People's Campaign in the Commonwealth of Kentucky. And we'll be looking at the race to succeed John Conyers Jr. in the city of Detroit. Unfortunately, the city of Detroit has been without representation in the Congress since the forced resignation of Congressman Conyers. An unfortunate situation there. Now, the winner of this race coming up will no doubt represent the district. We'll talk about the various characters that are involved. And as usual, you have some personal ambition over what is good for the cause of progressives. And this is unfortunate in the city of Detroit. But that will be sorted out in the campaign. We'll talk about that. We'll first talk about trade. That has been a big issue this week and this month and so forth and so on. One of the things we've noticed on the DJ Trump Twitter line that's replaced the Twitter king of Cory Booker, the former mayor of the urban ghetto of Newark, which is no longer an urban ghetto, that he is gone. But now the sellout is in the Senate. And DJ Trump has taken over the Twitter. But the situation here is on trade. The U.S. has a sordid history on the issue of trade going back to the Smoot tariffs that historians have said that was a precursor to, quote-unquote, the Great Depression. Well, tariffs in a modern industrial world where we have industrialized capitalism now, and we have many nations that were not in that scenario in the 30s. China, for instance, is there, and many, many others. You have the EU. that is functioning. We have the Russian Federation to a certain extent, and many products that can be placed under tariff regimes. The World Trade Organization was supposed to, as they say, flatten out some of these problems. Recall being in Seattle demonstrating against the World Trade Organization. And then we came from a point of view that the World Trade Organization, although it was a perverted capitalist attempt to rule the world, would eventually serve or not serve as a opening a point. It's sort of like Karl Marx talked about bourgeois democracy and how bourgeois elections would pave the way for socialism. He was correct about that. But nonetheless, these tariffs here, what DJ Trump and his advisors are not executing is intelligent tariffs. He talked about the intelligence of LeBron James. I think the problem here is these quotes on intelligence are quotes of subjectivity. In other words, subjective on DJ Trump's part. But there are so-called intelligence tests out there. There's roughly 200 of those. He's also labeled that on Representative Waters of South Central Los Angeles. The problem is that these people challenge DJ Trump, and DJ Trump has to take one of these intelligence tests. Who will end up on top? That's a big question, an open question out there. This kind of rhetoric is not doing any good at all, period. And we'll also look at a race out in several of these races around in Oklahoma and one in Minnesota, where the candidate for governor there, Tim Hu Pawlenty, has taken on a very, very right-wing posture as an opportunist to seek out the Trump vote as the only chance of winning the gubernatorial election in November. He calls himself a conservative Republican. Well, that in itself is folly, because the Republicans are conservatives, whether they want to be or not. All the moderate Republicans have either left the party or retired, period. And he is running on immigration. Immigration is one of those issues that, depending on where you are, doesn't affect the state. And his whole thing is that immigrants are taking up millions of dollars of quote-unquote hard-working taxpayers' money. That is just sheer preposterous. But we'll get to that later. Let's deal with Uncle Carl and trade. Who will convince Trump? He's writing in the Wall Street Journal on trade on the 2nd of August. President Trump appears to trade has vacillated widely since he took office. And this in itself is contrary to basic business principles. The term business-like. Business people do not like vacillation. You have to take a position and stay there. When the White House trade advisor Peter Navarro spoke about trade policy, that was in March of 2017, the administration appeared mercantilist. The only good trade arrangements was one in which a foreign trading partner ran a trade deficit with the U.S. When the administration started demanding that certain countries buy more select U.S. products to narrow but not necessarily erase the trade imbalance, it sounded as if it was pursuing a managed trade agenda, that they're not. When the president in March placed tariffs on imports to protect domestic steel and aluminum, whatever you want to pronounce it, industries from competition at the expense of American consumers and other U.S. businesses, he looked like a Holly Smoop, and we talked about that protectionist. Well, yeah, that causes depression. But in last week's press conference with the EU Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker, Mr. Trump committed, at least in theory, to a wide range of so-called free trade agenda. He and Juncker released a joint statement pledging the U.S. and EU would work towards zero tariffs. zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies on non-auto industrial goods. The statement also said the U.S. and EU would aim to reduce barriers, increase trade in services, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, medical products, as well as soybeans, and to reduce bureaucratic obstacles and slash cost of trade. Mr. Trump hinted at as recent as early July that the U.S. should withdraw from the WTO, or World Trade Organization, but his statement with Mr. Jokor pledged a joint Euro-American effort to reform the WTO so it could address unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft, focused technology, forced technology transfers, industrial subsidies, distortions caused by state-owned enterprises, and overcapacity. This is welcome if belated recognition that strong, modernized WTO offers the best path for addressing China's trade abuses. That is a purely subjective standpoint, and China has answered tit for tat on these various tariffs that the Trump administration has proposed, including liquefied gas. They're a big customer for liquefied gas, but they can buy it elsewhere. They can buy it from the Russian Federation. They can buy it from a number of other countries, period. And this is liquefied gas. Now, what happens if it comes from Iran and they stop an Iranian ship from moving into China? This could literally start a world war. So this is some of the eggshells that the Trump administration's non-intelligence policy is walking on. Trump may walk back his pledges. Indeed, news Wednesday that the administration is considering raising tariffs on $200 billion of Chinese imports to 25%, suggesting his so-called free trade. Free trade, going back to Adam Smith, has been nothing but a trip to Disneyland, although Adam Smith didn't have Disneyland. Turn may not last long, but if he stays the course he charted last week, the hard part is yet to come. The president regularly castigates his predecessors for having negotiated the worst trade deals ever made. Can he do better? And that is a big question there. Placing 25% tariffs on Chinese products. The Chinese position should be, so what? You can place 25%, 35, or even 50%. It doesn't really matter as long as the Chinese have something that they can place tariffs on also. And that situation is during the days of Hallie Smoot, you had a very, very small American economy, and at that time, in terms of industrialized nations, the U.S. was one of the leading nations. But that is no longer the case. There are many more nations out there that have products such as soybeans, etc., that they can sell to the world. Brazil comes to mind, and various others are capable of doing that. The same in the liquefied gas trade. And that is a problem within itself. We were looking at an article out of Odessa, Texas, I believe it was, that the Halliburton organization was looking for 100 or so workers and having a very hard time finding them. They need people to do simple things as driving a truck or trucks, and have commercial chauffeur's license people from far away, as Mississippi were coming there. But the problem there is the boom and bust nature of that particular sector, and a lot of the U.S. is going to be, I think, number 2 now in liquefied gas, could be number 1 in liquefied gas. But if China pulls out, that sort of caps it, and you have people already investing in that sector will start to disinvest. In fact, the Chinese have not taken orders, I think, the last 3 months. They're preparing for this. There are no longer fools on the sideline. This is a problem that Trump people have. An arrogant administration that assumes that people are not intelligent and launches a fully farcical program will, as they say, bear the rod. In fact, the stock market, some of the money managers, I think we have this in and we'll go to it, but let's back to finish up Uncle Carl. Under G.W. Bush efforts, he oversaw the passage of free trade agreement with 13 of 20 nations that have such accords with the U.S. For 2016, the Department of Commerce reported U.S. exports in goods and services to these countries totaled $158.6 billion, while American imports were at $99 billion, producing a surplus of $59.6 billion. And the Department of Commerce can prove before and after numbers on trades in goods services for only 3 of G.W. Bush's MTAs, but they are illuminating. The U.S. trade surplus with Singapore expanded from $5.4 billion before to $18.5 billion in 2016. The U.S. also entered a trade agreement with Chile. That was in 2004. The balance of trade went from $467 million deficit to $6.7 billion surplus in 2018. The U.S. surplus with Australia grew from $9.7 billion before and to $27.3 billion in 2016. From the Central American trading bloc, encompassing Costa Rica, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, pre-trade balances for services not available, but the U.S. has trade deficit in goods with 4 to 6 participating nations before CAPTA. In 2017, the U.S. had a surplus in goods with all but one, Nicaragua. And moreover, the Commerce Department's data, big data, shows the sale of U.S. services to the Bush FTA countries increased 21% from 2013 to 2016, compared with 7.3% growth in sales of services to the world over the same period. So he makes a case here, what we'll call a business case, on the trade numbers. But DJ Trump comes from the Holly Smoot era. The idea that you can intimidate emerging nations, that may be factual to a certain point, but once it starts, and these nations, as China has been doing, are anticipating that, and they have literally cut off their trade, their buying, I should say. And that in itself is around the edges. On the numbers, man, that is our economics program, macro. We'll talk about that and the number of jobs, roughly 150 so 1,000 jobs created, revised for June and July. But you can expect that. That's why we have the seesaw model. There was a picture of one of the economists riding on a roller coaster that writes generally in the New York Times. We have it somewhere around here, but it is a roller coaster economy. And looking towards the 2018 elections, DJ Trump has said nothing. That's why he moved on to LeBron James, because he knows these numbers. One of the big problems you have is today an instant historical analysis that he berated President Barack Obama as for having a subpar economy. But the problem here is that he has had subpar months also, and riding on the Obama economy as these tariffs. And it takes a while for these things to kick in. And you're seeing some of the preliminary consequences, but going beyond the November elections into 2020, you will start to see the full consequences. The problem is, even if you negotiate, quote-unquote, a trade deal, the damage that has been done multiplies, and that is what you start to see with liquefied gas. 90 days of not buying it, and then it has to move on someplace else. And many times what happens is once you lose those markets, you lose those markets. And sometimes it's a permanent situation. So therefore, you have to look at it. Let's just move on here to Reuters. News agency, U.S. courts order the Trump administration to fully reinstate DECA program. That is, a federal judge ruled that the Trump administration must fully restore the program that protects from deportation young immigrants who were brought to the U.S. illegally as children, accepting a new applications. And there, the district judge, John Bates, in D.C., said he would stay Friday's order, however, until the 23rd of August to give the administration time to decide whether to appeal. Bates first issued a ruling in May ordering the federal government to continue the deferred action for childhood arrivals, including taking applications. He stayed that ruling for 90 days to give the government time to explain why the program should end. On Friday, Bates, who was appointed by G.W. Bush, a Republican, said he would not revise his previous ruling because the arguments of the Trump administration did not override his concerns. Roughly have 700,000 of these young people. The program was created in 2011 by Barack Obama. Two other federal courts in California and New York had previously ordered that DECA remain in place while litigation challenging the Trump's decision. Another lawsuit in Texas is seeking to end DECA. The whole problem here is that DECA is a very valuable program. If they end it, what do they replace it with? Friday's ruling came as a lawsuit filed by several groups, including the NAACP and Princeton University. So, in other words, they're out here. This LeBron James, to the sporting world and largely beyond, he's King James. But Trump says he is no intellectual genius. In a tweet, Trump took aim at two of his regular critics, James and Don Lemon of CNN. He called Lemon the dumbest man on TV, and then said that Lemon made LeBron look smart, which isn't easy to do, according to DJ Trump. He said, I like Mike, referring to Michael Jordan, and compared with James as perhaps the best NBA player ever. James, of course, announced his decision to leave Cleveland, the Cavaliers, for Los Angeles, and play for the Lakers. Gave an interview on Monday night, in large part to taunt a new elementary school in his hometown of Akron, Ohio. The school is a joint effort of the LeBron James Foundation, and the Akron public school system will benefit at-risk children. During the sit-down, James spoke of sports as something that unites people. That has been the prevailing situation since Jackie Robinson, and he added that the president was using sports to divide us. Trump has repeatedly and strongly criticized NFL players, in particular, for not punishing players who kneel during the national anthem in the form of protest. Sports has never been something that divides people, James said during the interview. It's always been something that brings someone together. James had previously criticized DJ Trump, publicly supporting Hillary Clinton and calling Trump a bum. In September 2017, after the president rescinded an invitation to Golden State Warriors to visit the White House. They've never looked back. Going to the White House was a great honor until you showed up, James tweeted at the time. First commented, this is DJ Trump on the NFL, and players who protested during the anthem came late last month. So he's changed the subject. That is a quote-unquote red meat or whatever, spaghetti, macaroni and cheese, whatever his supporters or ramen noodles, I'm sorry, are eating these days in their times. This is also from Reuters here. Investors moved to cash, anticipating Democratic gains in November. A part of this becomes a psychology of not only the markets, where the economy is going, but of the political situation. Now, in 2016, there was great anticipation by many that Hiroshimaana Clinton would win the presidential race. But due to numerous things out there, in terms of voter suppression is number one, and number two, malpractice by Hiroshimaana Clinton's general staff. Number three, many of us felt that voting for the monster was a waste of time. As the late great Jerry Pippin said, she was going nowhere. And he used to be an enthusiastic supporter of the monster in 2008. But because of the mistreatment of Bernie Sanders, many people did not show up. And that, coupled with other reservations about her, DJ Trump escaped and into the White House with roughly about 80,000 votes. Now, electoral votes was a little different situation. But if you go into states like Michigan and states like Wisconsin, those were states that the monster could have won but did not win. And in Pennsylvania, she spent time there, but the numbers just did not work out. And in Ohio, the Democratic Party was not organized and had not organized properly. We'll see how it turns out in 2018 elections coming up. But those are some of the things happening. And when you see fund managers moving to cash and rotating away from sectors like financials and technology, I can see the greatest regulatory moves. The Oppenheimer Fund is one, and BNO Global Asset Managers among those who are repositioning their portfolios and seeing cash as more attractive as the comes up. Chief among their concerns, the so-called blue wave of Democratic victories. That is one thing always to note, a blue wave of it. In other words, anticipation. What happens if the Democrats come up short of winning the House? Well, they've had an impressive run, period. And it depends on how much they lose it by. If they win the House, well, they win the House. And that depends on who is, as they say, in place, what the House leadership is, and what happens in the Senate. They're defending a lot of positions. We talked about it on a Friday Jobber, the people at the University of Virginia, Larry Sabato's shop, the Crystal Ball, and their 50-50 better than 50-50 projection. That was a week before, and last week they were talking about from what it was a 1913 election on to 2016, and the parties in power, out of party also. Now, from Clear Politics, a polling aggregation site, the Democrats had a lead of 7%. I wouldn't count much on that. It's a generic ballot at this particular time in the process. 7%, 5%, or whatever. There is a little bit difference, and we'll look at Real Clear Politics as we move along here. But stay tuned. The benchmark of 500 is up 5.2% for the year. The economy grew at 4.1% in Q2. That was the fastest since 2014, which was a transitional year. It was 2 years after Barack Obama had won re-election. Anyway, let's roll on here to the Washington Post. Now, this is on the so-called voter fraud, the most bizarre thing I've ever seen, ever been part of. The Trump panel found no voter fraud, ex-member says, and this is by Eli Rosenberg. The Maine Secretary of State Matthew Dunlap, one of 11 members of the commission formed by DJ Trump to investigate support voter fraud, issued a scathing rebuttal of the disband panel on Friday. The vice chair there, Kurt Kobach, and the White House making false statements and saying that he had concluded that the panel had been set up to try to validate the president's baseless claims about fraudulent votes. Now, this is a very important cannon fodder here. Dunlap, one of 4 Democrats on the panel, made the statement in a report he sent to the commission's 2 leaders, Pence and Kobach, who is the Kansas Secretary of State, after reviewing more than 8,000 documents from the group's work, which he acquired only after a legal fight despite participation on the panel. It was disbanded in January. The panel never presented any findings or evidence, and this is a whole thing of empty words. Sort of like talking about LeBron James's intelligence or Representative Waters of South Central. DJ Trump does not have their IQ scores. We're positive of that. So when he's talking about it, it's not even very good rhetoric. It falls under fake news, and we did a special on that. Fakes and more fakes. There are a lot of fakes out there, but part of the problem about this so-called fake news campaign, pronouncements via Twitter, etc. That's a stream of consciousness campaign. It goes good when it's going good, but when it goes south, it does go south. In fact, in a lot of Trump's arguments are meat for some of the base, but as his base peels away, even if he loses 2% of his base vote in the November 18, either they stay home or whatever they do, the Democrats will have their field day, because he has to go to the core, period. Let me finish this up here. Pointed to an outliner from a report the commission was working on that circulated in 2014. The outline included sections from improper voter registration practices, instances of fraud or improper voting. Through the sections themselves were blank as they awaited evidence. This thing is just farcical. It's a joke. After reading this, Dunlap said the more than 8,000 pages documented interview with the Washington Post, I see that it was just a matter of investigating President Trump's claim that 2 to 3 million people voted illegally. But the goal of the commission seemed to have been to validate those claims. Well, he never validated the claims. You have to have evidence, and they had no evidence. Dunlap filed a lawsuit against the commission that is still active in November. The materials provide a window into the panel's operation. One email, Christy McCormick, a Republican member on the commission, spoke to his staff members about recruiting career statisticians from the Department of Justice to the commission, writing that she was pretty confident that he is a conservative and a Christian too. Oh boy. Other documents show what American Oversight, the accountability-focused nonprofit working on a lawsuit with Dunlap, said an attempt to shut him out and other Democratic members of the commission with Pence. And it's good that this is going over to Pence. If Pence has any bright ideas of running for president on his own, or if he ends up, as they say, with the keys to the White House because of DJ Trump's early departure. Anything can happen. Trump's claim that as many as 3 to 5 million fraudulent voters were cast remains one of the most notable falsehoods. No doubt about that. It's just dreaming up numbers. But you have to understand the nature of many of these people. There's the big thing about the Qs, and these people believe anything. Fairy tales. Lawsuit's not yet resolved. Anyway, we'll leave it at that period. We'll go to John Conyers in Detroit. This is also from the Washington Post. Their principal candidate says Sabrina Jackson spent her Sunday night at a nightclub packed with fellow African-American Detroiters who want to send Brenda Johnson to Congress. For 12 years, she has watched Brenda Jones, do amazing things on the city council, and as Detroit emerged from bankruptcy and began revising decades of decline. But she still misses John Conyers Jr. Jackson is 52 years old. The downfall of Conyers, an icon of African-American politics, who resigned last year. It's sort of like what happened to Mr. Franken in Minnesota, under a flurry of so-called accusations that he mistreated and made advances towards female aides, the cheapest trick in the book. Conyers, who was the longest-serving member of Congress and longest-serving African-American member, he co-founded the Congressional Black Caucus and was one of 20 names on President Nixon's enemy list. He's the only member of Congress endorsed by Martin Luther King Jr., and he gave a job to Rosa Parks that no one would hire. Most people don't understand that Ms. Parks, who didn't give her a seat up on the bus, and it wasn't the only time she refused to give it up, couldn't get a job, the Parks family, in Birmingham, Alabama. They moved to Detroit. John Conyers gave her a job, and she kept that job well into her late 70s, perhaps into her 80s. We talked about the long delay caused by Gateway Snyder. In contrast, this is the largest city, Detroit, in Michigan. Republican out in Arizona, Trent Franks, resigned the same week as Conyers. The election to replace him was held on April 24th. His successor has been voting in Congress. The African people of Detroit have not. And from Greg Mathis, he's host of Judge Mathis, I suspect that a part of the government continues the marginalization of poor and communities of color in Michigan, no doubt about it. And these are some of the names running here. One is named Conyers. One is also a son of the late great Coleman Young, the first African-American mayor of Detroit. Both local Democrats say are underdogs in a race where most party leaders have swung behind Jones, and the money has went to Rashida Tlaib. A poll released this week, and they don't mention the poll, I don't like that. Both are tied with Bill Weil, some mayor out in Westland, Michigan. The election is not the handoff that Conyers first elected in 1964 was thinking about. He thought that he would pass it on to one of his eldest son. He's kind of disappeared. JC3, as he is known, had no political experience. That is unfortunate. And so he failed to even get on the ballot. Utterly incompetent. The Conyers brand moved on to grandnephew Ian Conyers, state representative, former congressional aide, who turns 30 this fall. Green and white signs embossed with his name have sprung up on lawns similar to the blue and white signs left over from the elder Conyers. In an interview before he attended church service near his home, Ian Conyers has said he would continue the work of his legendary uncle. No doubt he will. Coleman Young II, who is 35, spent 11 years in the legislature. Has a good name in Detroit, but will his name carry the day? It's a crowded field. The 13th congressional district is the most challenged, and shall I say the poorest in the state of Michigan. That's what Ms. Jones said in an interview in her campaign office. While the Westland mayor is running largely on his experience, what experiences he have. Although Democrats in Detroit have not sent a European to Congress since John F. Kennedy was in the White House, it's twice elected some guy named Duggan, who was a European in 2017. He won his second term by a landslide over Coleman Young II. Part of that is disunity in the African American community. We saw a similar pattern, unfortunately, start to show its ugly head with the unexpected death of Harold Washington out in Chicago. But the community imploded. Various people came forth with self-interest in the community and ended up with nothing. Idiocy, jackassery appeared there, and it's Hopefully in Detroit it will not appear. In cities like Atlanta and in New Orleans, it has not appeared. The community has become united. Period. While cites Tolubi, the former state leader, as a sort of candidate who couldn't. Well, that is crazy. To enter Congress and bring the resources home. How in the hell is he going to bring the resources home? This is this wild guy. All these characters cite experience. Has been a mayor, so what? Toluba, who's potential to become the first female Muslim in Congress, has attracted a lot of national attention. Had not heard of her. And money. We're not approaching poverty the same way. We're not approaching the issue of immigration the same way. She said, people say I'm combative, but what I appreciated about Congressman Conyers was he would do things like that. He was listed as a plaintiff in a number of lawsuits about economic justice, no doubt about that. Reparations there. And she saw a liberal legend leave too soon. Detroit and Dearborn and Westlake iced out of Congress. I was disappointed, she said. So some of these candidates are very good candidates. I don't know. We'll look at that particular situation as it comes forward there. And let me just Democrat. It's Tuesday. As it's until the winner of Tuesday's Democratic primary, the triumphs in a special election in November. No Republicans filed a run on that seat. So in other words, the Democrat would win by default. Let's get to Clear Channel here. Let me just look at the time. We're running a little low, but that's okay. Some polling we have out here. Remington Resources, that is out of Oklahoma. Stiff, I think is his name, over Cornett. Cornett being the mayor of Oklahoma City, up by 10 points according to this. And the Independent Business Daily, an accurate poll on the DJ Trump's approval rating at 41%. And the outliner here, Rasmussen at 48%. Yeah, forget them. In Oregon, this is on Thursday. Ms. Brown is up by 1 point. That's a very close race out in Oregon. We'll look at it a little bit more. And on Wednesday, we had a slew of polls. Most we've reported before. Out of Arizona, the Republican primary has McSally up by 8. This is ABC here, ABC 15. And Sonoma, Similar, whatever the name, up by 4 over McSally, up by 10 over Chemtrail Ward, and up by 18 over old former Sheriff Joe Arpaio. And the Quantipac here, let's see, the Texas Senate race, Cruz up by 6. That race is closing up there. Beto O'Rourke is closing in on Cruz. That'd be very interesting there, as that race is tightened. That race at one time was in the double digits in Lion Ted's favor. Out of Michigan, this is Mitchell Research. They've been known in Michigan. They have James. This is the Republican primary, up by 14, and in the that's for the Senate. In the Republican primary for governor, Shetty, I suppose, is up by 22. Texas governor's race, Wheelchair Abbott's up by 13 over Valdez, former sheriff of Dallas County. And let's see what else we got here of any consequences. Generic ballots by YouGov has the Democrats up by 4. It's almost in the margin of government. Margin of error. Democrats by 6 on Reuters. Democrats by 6 even on Rasmussen. So Democrats up 2 or 3 percentage points any way you want to look at it. Let's get back to the Poor People's Campaign, the Commonwealth of Kentucky. This is from Facing South. This is Junior Walters. The Poor People Campaign faced down a hostile state government in Kentucky. Since May, activists across the U.S. have united under the banner of the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. I guess not in Kentucky. In state capitals from North Carolina to California, no chapter has more difficulty in confronting their elected officials. They were actually shut out in the one in Kentucky. The fourth poorest state, with 18.5% of the population living below the poverty level. It was the first to deny access to the State House during a kickout rally back in June. The campaign vocally protests the restricted rule, and the national leader, Dr. Barber, traveled to Kentucky to speak out against it. Your governor is determined to violate the Constitution he has sworn to uphold, the Reverend Dr. Barber told activists in Frankfurt press conference. The administration of the governor there, Blevin, has drawn most of the criticism from the Kentucky campaign. Blevin took office in 2015 amidst a conservative resurgence in the state, being one of only two Republican governors in Kentucky since 1970. He has the backing of the state legislature, which last year came under total GOP control. In January, Kentucky became the first state to propose work requirements for Medicaid. The proposal was swiftly approved by D.J. Trump, but was struck down by a federal judge. This would deny, Medicaid vision and dental care coverage for 400,000, almost 500,000 Kentuckians. He definitely does not agree with us on the root cause of poverty, McMitchell said a week after Beshear issued his 3rd of July option. The Poor People's Campaign entered the state capital and delivered a stroll to Blevin's office. Now, despite clashes with the Blevin administration, the Poor People's Campaign, with some key Democrats within the state government, for example, Allison Lundgren Grimes provided water for the protesters, while the Attorney General Andy Beshear, he is the son of the former governor, Mr. Beshear. A legal opinion room at the administration, 2 in and 2 out State House rule was unconstitutional. In Facing South, Mick Michael criticized Blevin for his cavalier attitude. The cavalier attitude has been all over the place. The challenge is to motivate and to get people educating each other about issues, Mick Michael said. Like the national campaign, Kentucky does not focus solely on poverty, but also addresses such issues as ecological devastation, healthcare. Healthcare is an important part of poverty. Roughly 1,000 people have been involved in the campaign in Kentucky, from the urban centers of Bowling Green and Louisville to rural eastern Kentucky, where generations of coal miners have taken a severe environmental toll. Black Lung being there. Kentucky hits the polls on May 6th, and they will not vote for governor. That race takes place next year. To date, Blevin only declared challenge is the Attorney General Beshear. So we're appreciative of our friends at Turning South, and we're glad to have them on this review. On to sport. Urban Meyer, he is the coach at Ohio State, issued a statement Friday saying that he failed when he denied knowing about domestic violence allegations against one of his former assistant coach, Zach Smith. We'll have more on this on the Monday Morning Quarterback. On to baseball scores. From Friday night, the Padres were in Wrigley Field. Cubs 4-5 finally win a game there. The Cubs had 10 hits, 1 error, and the Padres 8 hits, no errors. The Marlins were in Philadelphia. Phillies 5-1. The Phillies have been winning lately. The Cardinals were in Pittsburgh, which they would have stayed in St. Louis, but it was a nice score, a nice game. 7-6 was the score. The Pirates had 12 hits, 1 error, and the Cardinals 15 hits and no error, and still lost the game. The Yankees and Red Sox in Fenway Park. Sox 4-1 there. Porcello was the winner. The Angels in Cleveland. Angels 7-4. Atlanta in New York. Atlanta 2-1 over the Mets. And in 10, the White Sox were in Florida. White Sox won the game 3-2. The Orioles were in Texas and Rangers 11-3. The Rockies and Brewers in Milwaukee. They are back in Milwaukee now after being on a tour of the West. The Brewers 5-3. The Royals and Twins in the Twin Cities. 6-4 the score there. The Giants and D-backs in the desert of Arizona. D-backs is 6-3. Tight race out west. A game we tuned in. It was a very good game. It was very well pitched. Mr. Wood was the loser. Mr. Verlander was the winner. Hector Rodon, the former Cub, got the save. Nonetheless, it was 2-1 Astros. It was almost like the 7th game of the World Series. I'd forgotten about the dynamics of the World Series. The Dodgers made it there. The Cubs did not. But they came up short. 3-3. Dodgers came back from behind, if I recall, in that series, and tied the series up, and still lost it. But it's a different team this year. But still, it was a hellacious game. The Tigers in Athletics out in Oakland. Athletics 1-0. That was in 13. The Blue Jays and Mariners in Seattle. It was all Blue Jays. Toronto 7-2. And postponed, I assume, to rain. The Reds and Nationals in D.C. This will do it for us. The week that was on the 4th of August 2018. We have a numbers man. That is a financial report, economics report, coming up this weekend, and also an open source report. We still owe you a report on the Zimbabwean election. That election, a very interesting election there. We do also have an interview with the former president, Dr. Mugabe. But the problem there is Emerson, whatever his name is, the so-called new appointed president by the military, ended up, it was about 6 points. Evidently, the last I heard it from Reuters of the BBC, it was down to 1 percentage point. The opposition does not recognize the election. There were people murdered after it. We'll bring that on a BR on the World, and eventually it will make it over to Boston Red, the political channel, in edited version, no doubt. Nonetheless, have a good weekend. You can find us on the iHeart app, on Stitcher, I'm sorry, Stitcher, and on YouTube, and various other outlets included. I don't know anything about Apple. What we do with anymore, didn't get any statistics on it for a very long time. We're working on, incidentally, finally revising BostonRed.org to bring it up to date. And also, we hope to get that talk show up over on Blog Talk before Blog Talk Radio disappears. Good day.